Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about two more theories of personality. The first is social cognitive, and the second is trait theory. First is social cognitive. Social cognitive combines two schools of thought. Number one is the social aspect and how a person interacts with their environment. And the second part is the cognitive aspect, which is our thinking and how our thinking plays a role in how we interact in our environment. So, social cognitive theorists believe that the way we interpret what happens to us based on our environment can help determine our personality. The two key figures we're going to talk about with regards to this theory are Albert Bandura and Julian Rotter. Albert Bandura, if you remember from our learning unit, was a social um, theorist, and he believed in the idea of social learning. And I'll talk about his experiment in a second if you need a review. But he believed that we have three factors in our personality that are reciprocal, meaning they work together. He called it triadic reciprocality. And it's your personality traits that are your underlying aspects of your personality, your behavior, those reinforcements and punishments in your environment, and then your actual environment that you're brought up in. And he said these three factors really help determine what your personality is going to be like. If you recall from our learning unit, Albert Bandura's experiment was the Bobo doll experiment, where children were either shown an adult beating up a Bobo doll or being passive with a Bobo doll. And we know that from observational learning, kids are more likely to interact with the doll violently if they saw an adult doing it violently, or to be more passive if they did not see an adult being violent with the doll. Albert Bandura also identified self efficacy as a key factor to our personality and also that social learning, that we have to believe that we can perform a task to actually do it. If we believe we're competent enough to perform something, we're more likely to do it. If we don't believe we are competent, we are less likely to do it. So in the Bobo doll experiment, the kids had to believe they could do similar behaviors to the adult beating up the Bobo doll in order to actually do it. If they didn't believe they could do the same behaviors, they wouldn't mimic the behavior. So this is the social aspect. We watch others, we learn, we use our traits, our behavior, and our environment to determine personality. This is different than Carl Rogers' theory of personality. Remember, he's a humanist, and Carl Rogers emphasized the importance of ourselves and mental health, that congruence or that agreement between our self concept and life experiences. And over here on the right side of the slide, you can see if the two things overlap and a person can be well adjusted, or if the person does not unite their experience and their ideal self, that self concept, they're going to have more poorly adjusted existence in society. Next, we're going to move on to the trait perspective. The trait perspective is where there are a number of characteristics that people use to describe themselves. Trait theory and social cognitive theory go together because it's about thinking about ourselves and those underlying aspects of our personality that are present most or all of the time. So, a trait is defined as a relatively stable and consistent personality characteristic or a behavior tendency. You probably know if you're more introverted or extroverted. You probably know if you like to volunteer or if you're more shy in class. These are traits. They're relatively stable. You know if you have a good sense of humor or if you tend to be a little more dry with your sense of humor, or if you tend to be very bubbly and outgoing, or if you tend to be more quiet. These are traits that no matter what type of scenario you're in, these traits are still going to be there. Chances are, if you're shy in one context, you're likely to be shy in other contexts. Maybe not every context, but some. The different theories disagree as to how our traits should be classified. Some theories have a ton of traits, others have a few traits. So first is Gordon Allport. Gordon Allport is the first person that developed trait theory, and he created a list of 18,000 traits. Yes, 18,000. He literally looked at a dictionary and pulled out any term he believed referred to a person's underlying personality traits, and he thought people could be classified amongst 18,000 traits. Raymond Cattell narrowed Allport's list to 200 traits. He said within the 18,000 traits that Gordon Allport designed, that there were really 200 trait categories that you could narrow it down. And he used factor analysis. Factor analysis is where you combine like terms and separate out different terms. So he nestled those 18,000 terms from Allport into 200 trait categories. And then he developed the 16PF, or personality factor questionnaire, that I talked about in a previous screencast. And this allows psychologists to describe personality based on how a person falls within these 16 personality factor categories, which holds 200 traits, which then holds 18,000 traits. This is just a general overview of the 16PF test, things that the psychologist would be looking for based on how people answer the questionnaires. You can go and look at this in the slide deck later if you wish to look at it more closely. Then there was Hans Eysenck. Hans Eysenck developed factor analysis to simplify the long list of traits. 18,200, too many. So Hans Eysenck actually developed 3 factors that he believed all of our personality traits fell under 3 different factors. The first is how extroverted you are on a scale of extrovert to introvert. And then he looked at emotional stability. So are you stable or are you unstable? And so he said stability versus instability. And he also called it neuroticism. We don't call it neuroticism anymore because that has a negative connotation in this context. Neuroticism makes you seem like you can't control your emotions, whereas stable versus unstable is better. This is an image that shows what Hans Eysenck's biological trait theory looks at. And so you can see on the left side, introverted all the way to extroverted, and emotional to stable. So it would be emotional would be instability, stable would be stability. And you can see as you go along the circle, you can see the different traits that are related to if you are extroverted and stable, extroverted versus emotional, introverted, whatever. And so you fall on the scale vertically and horizontally between one of those things. The things in the center are based on your humors. So when the Renaissance was happening, and even a little bit prior, you had people determining illness and people's challenges based on their humors. And so these humors in the middle of the circle were what Hans Eysenck said you would have if you fell within a part of the circle. We don't use those humors anymore, but that was his original design. Then we move on to the big 5-factor test, which is the most commonly used model today when we talk about personality traits and trait theory. Most psychologists felt that Cattell's 16 factors were too many, Eysenck's 3 factors were too small, and so the middle ground that they came to was a 5-factor model. It's called CANOE, or sometimes you see it as OCEAN. The big 5 factors CANOE is you are on a range or on a spectrum based on these 5 personality characteristics: conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, or again, emotional stability versus instability, openness, and extroversion. So you fall on a scale of conscientious to not, agreeableness to not agreeable, emotional stability versus instability, openness versus closed, extroversion versus introversion. Again, here's a diagram that talks about the personality characteristics that might be under each trait. You can look back at that in the slideshow on your own. So, some summary of trait theory. Your traits are relatively stable personal characteristics used to describe who you are. The people that are early trait theorists are Allport, Cattell, and Eysenck. And the 5-factor model was developed by McCrae and Costa. I didn't say that. Now, Julian Rotter. Julian Rotter developed something called the locus of control. He believed that people's personalities could be impacted by internal versus external control. So if you had an internal locus of control, that meant that you really used yourself and your guiding principles and your own thinking to make decisions about your life. If you have an external locus of control, that means outside factors are really controlling your personality and your decision making. So the effects of that are your internal locus of control can make it so a person has a really strong sense of um, self concept and self identity, whereas external locus of control, sometimes people can struggle with that. Martin Seligman, we also already talked about in learning. Just to review, he's the person that developed the theory of learned helplessness. He studied the dogs with the shock floor and basically discovered that if you shock a dog enough times, they eventually give up and lay down instead of trying to avoid the shock. And so he believed that humans have this learned helplessness, and that if we can't control uh, something bad happening and we perceive we have a lack of control, it can lead to helpless behavior and this generalized sense of I'm helpless, I can't do it on my own. So you give up. And so he believes that the scientific study of positive psychology, or helping people develop strength and their own belief that they can get through challenging times, can help an individual or a community survive and thrive. Additionally, personality comes down to a lot of factors. We've talked about a lot of nurture, some nature so far. Most of our theories we've talked about have had a lot of nurture involved and some nature. There are also biological theories related to personality. It's important to remember that our brain is pre-wired to have aspects of personality, and our frontal lobe and our limbic system, um, with memory, with our amygdala, with emotion. There's lots of parts of our brain that tie into personality. There's also neurochemistry. There's the actual hormones that can either help our personality or get in the way of our personality. And then there's genetic factors. There's actually evidence that our genes play a role in how our personality develops. So it's not just the fact that your parents raised you that your personality might be similar to one or both of your parents. There's actually a genetic aspect to that that can make your personality similar because of your genes and the way your brain works. There's also a cultural influence on personality. Individualistic cultures, we know, like the United States, really emphasize an individual person's needs and goals over the group, trying to be number one, trying to get ahead of the game, getting into the best school, being the best athlete on the team. Individualistic cultures really emphasize that and support and help people thrive with personalities that go for that. Whereas collectivist cultures emphasize the needs of the group over the individual. So they're going to downplay someone who's individualistic and support the thriving of someone who is more collectivistic and cares about the welfare of the group. So their team goals are going to be different than team goals in an individualistic culture like our own. A country like Japan is a collectivist culture where people work together to have success as opposed to try to rise above the rest. That is the end of this screencast. And after this, you're going to have some opportunity to practice and take some personality tests of your own. Hope you're well. Talk to you soon.